But the final and the most decisive of Becker's points is that despite all the complexity and ambiguity of the historian's enterprise, each man and each woman on this planet carries around in his or her mind a narrative of the past, usually quite untrammeled by the cautions and hesitancies of the professional historian. A narrative about the past that shapes one's views of the world and one's own place in that world. It will be out of that narrative of the past that, according to Professor Becker, will emerge one's fundamental attitudes and commitments toward religion, politics, other people, vocation and calling, and so on. Presumably then, though Becker does not go on to make this point, the richness and quality of that narrative will largely shape the size and nature of the world that each person lives in, and will profoundly affect the person's sense of responsibility and possibility for his or her own role in that world. And there are echoes here of another of Becker's English contemporary historians, Herbert Butterfield, who actually makes the rather fantastic claim that your decision about history is the most sovereign choice you will ever make as a human being. And he goes on to explore that in his series of essays called Christianity and History. Whatever one thinks of Professor Becker's epistemological assumptions, and that would be fun to engage today, that's not my main concern. It's his conclusion that I want us to draw on. For I believe that Professor Becker is absolutely right in that final point that he's trying to make, that every person has a narrative of the world and the past in her mind, and that it is powerful for shaping one's imagination, one's attitudes, one's sense of responsibility and possibility, one's understanding of the meaning of the present, and one's hopes for the future. Crucially, this power of memory to shape one's present and future is there and quite efficacious, whether the narrative in the mind of each person is deep or shallow, well-informed or poorly informed, nuanced or simplistic, true or false. This is why governments pay attention to history. And the more authoritarian the government, the more it has tended to pay attention to what its citizens believe about the past, understanding very well that one's individual and collective remembering is crucially linked to one's belief in the possibility of a better future and one's ability to move beyond the tyranny of the present to work for that, hopefully, better future. So, once again, I'm claiming that the nature of one's remembering will largely determine the size of one's world, one's identity, and one's sense of possibility, responsibility, and agency in the world. Or, to put it in slightly different words, the quality of one's remembering will largely determine one's sense of freedom in the world. And here at last is where history and the liberal arts meet up in these comments today. You may have been wondering when I was going to get to that point. See, the proper end or purpose of a liberal arts education, at least as I understand it, and certainly of a Christian liberal arts education, is that we become free. Free from prejudice, narrowness, smallness, selfishness, and blindness, and free for the large, creative, and loving world that God has prepared the large, creative, and loving work that God has prepared in advance for each of us to do in this world, linked, crucially, to the very individuals he has created us and redeemed us to be. And you may recognize there shades of Ephesians 2, 8 to 10. Part of this liberation that we speak of and associate with the liberal arts is learning to see fully and clearly the natural world that God has made. Part of that liberation is learning to speak and write with as much care and attention as our Father in heaven gave to words, climaxing in the sending of his Son to be the living word. And I could go on for all parts of the curriculum and talk about the ways in which each of the disciplines that we associate with the liberal arts is part of that liberating power of the liberal arts. But my job today is to focus on history, so let me return to that. A critical part of the liberation of the liberal arts is learning to remember well, acquiring a large, nuanced, and ruthlessly honest, at least as honest as we can get, remembering of the world. For the larger, more nuanced, and more honest our remembering of the world, the greater understanding we will have of other human beings in that world, the greater understanding we will have of our own place in the world, and the greater will be the freedom and the quality of love with which we are able to carry out our appointed work in the world. Now, if you are a student here today, and I actually wanted to prepare some of these comments deliberately for students, so I understand some of you have actually been given extra credit for being here today. So I'm glad that they're making it worth your while to be here, because I know sometimes it's hard to make choices just for the intrinsic value of late afternoon seminars. So if you are here and wondering, what does all this have to do with World Civ, I want to make a few suggestions. World Civ, in particular, invites us out of the center of our own universe, both geographically and chronologically. In fact, I think the biggest worry in my 23 years of teaching World Civ was the increased complaint toward the end of that time that I would hear from students, World Civ has nothing to do with me. It doesn't fit my world. And I always wanted to respond, although I was usually fairly diplomatic in my response, but I wanted to respond, of course it doesn't. It's not supposed to fit your world. World Civ, which is the required course in a liberal arts curriculum, is intended to put each of our small worlds into a much bigger world. And that slide that Marianne had on earlier presents that very graphically. So, history is about freedom from smallness of time and place. Secondly, World Civ invites us to be more self-conscious and self-aware about the process by which historical narratives are constructed. That's the point of all the work with primary sources that students often find so tedious. The point is not to come out cynical, but savvy, more honest and more aware of the fallenness of human frailty and malice that can creep into the construction of histories that purport to be the final word on the past. So history is about freedom from being taken in by simplistic interpretations of anything. World Civ, thirdly, invites us to empathy, to see how the world might look if we stood over there in that country or in that time frame for a while. It is helping us, in short, to know how to love better. So, freedom for love. World Civ invites us to an enlarged imagination of the many ways that human beings have approached the challenges of life, individually and collectively over time and space. So, history is about freedom from the limitations of our own imagination. Finally, World Civ invites us to expand our knowledge and love for God, as we come to see that a God whose love extends to all of his creatures may be larger than the God we have taken him to be. Our God is not a local tribal God. He is, as we've heard this morning, and as I think Professor Pointer will remind us in a few minutes, he is the Lord of all time and all places. It is no accident that the key events of liberation in the Old and the New Testaments are intimately linked with rituals of remembering. After the children of Israel came out of Egypt and over the Jordan, they were instructed to build an altar of 12 stones, one for each of the 12 tribes. And Joshua told the people, when your children ask you in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. So these stones shall be to the people a memorial forever, remembering stones, as it were. And then, of course, this is the whole point of the Passover celebration, remembering God's first great liberation from the slavery and bondage of Egypt. And then even closer to home, for Christians, we have our Lord's words spoken on the night of his betrayal and etched on many communion tables around the world. Do this in remembrance of me. The second Passover, the inauguration of God's final liberation from the slavery and bondage of sin and death. So what does history have to do with the liberal arts? History is the discipline by which we are challenged and invited to remember well. It is the discipline that teaches us the power of remembering, the horrific consequences when people are led to remember falsely, and the possibility of redemptive remembering, remembering that seeks to be large, nuanced, and as ruthlessly honest as we are capable of being as frail, finite creatures in this fallen world.